All right, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Everyone have a good weekend? No? Sweet. All right. So, uh, quick reminders. So, your quiz is on Wednesday. Um, so your quiz is on Wednesday. Uh, it will be the normal 90 minutes. In terms of breakdown, there's the classic like multiple choice, fill in the blank, things like that. The last two questions on the test are short answers, like little mini essays. Um, so when you're going through the exam, make sure that you leave yourself some time to write those. They aren't, super long, right? We're not asking for, 3-paragraph essay form, just, how much you need to answer the question, but somewhere probably between 3 and 6 sentences. One of them has like 3 different parts. So, like 2 sentences each, just, answering the question. I just want to make sure you all know to, you're not surprised at the end. So give yourself a little bit more leniency on that, or a little bit more time rather. And as in the past, when if it spits out a grade, be aware that's not your final grade. Obviously, I have these essay questions at the end, so obviously those are going to have to be manually graded. So don't worry about that. Your grade will be updated. I'll try to grade them as soon as I can. In terms of review, obviously you can always email me if you have a question, but I will have a review session tomorrow during my office hours. So I'll be on from 5 to 7. And so, I'll record that. If anyone comes by, post that on YouTube immediately afterward. Should upload pretty fast. But any concerns about that? Any questions? No? All right. Let me pull this up real quick. Sweet. All right. So today, oh, and one last note, I've posted all the rest of the stuff for this week. There's homework due at the end of the, or set up on Friday. I'm going to change the date just because I don't know if there's going to be enough time, since what the homework is on, we're talking about on Friday, or we're going to be talking about on Friday. So that homework will be due on Monday of next week. And but make sure to look over it before your discussion sessions and stuff. But it won't actually be due until Monday. But yeah, so today we're going to start going into Unit 5, the next one. And so this is continuing our pattern of trying to scale up your knowledge. If you were reading through the chapters and you feel like we're skipping over stuff, or there's a lot more info, because there is, this will be information that you'll come back to in 108 if you take it. 108 will be looking at the same kind of stuff as we are, but looking more through how information instead of energy is being passed on. And since we're talking about how energy is being passed through between organisms, now we're trying to scale that up, right? So last unit, we talked about how animals and plants each get their nutrients from an environment, how individuals grow, and how they interact. And now what we're going to be talking about is how scientists study communities of organisms, or how organisms interact with one another. So we're going to be talking about ecology, and then talking about the natural environment that a lot of organisms come into. So today will be a nice decently late day, talking about the different branches of ecology, as well as talking about things that affect what kind of environments exist on Earth. And so we're going to talk about ecology and biodiversity. So first and foremost, the professor would like to remind you that biodiversity is the variety of species or life in an ecosystem. And so we'll talk about biodiversity on multiple levels, as well as in different environments throughout the rest of this unit, and actually through the rest of this course. So be sure to remember biodiversity. We'll come back to it and talk a lot about it. But one thing that's important to note is that biodiversity is based on variety of species, not just the amount of species within an environment. And so biodiversity and ecology go hand in hand very often. When scientists are studying organisms, the biodiversity, the different types of organisms and life in a system will affect that base organism. So every individual in a population or an individual in an environment is going to be affected by everything else in that environment. Oh, well, the stock art professor is a white male because that's the professor from from the Powerpuff Girls. That's their father, their professor. Yeah, so today we'll be talking about ecology, or how we study the interactions between organisms and their environment, and the various different levels in which you can look at this. And what we'll see is that these questions can become very, very specific. And so obviously we have individuals. So we have a single member of a species. So in this case, we have some type of elk or deer, depending on how these are being drawn. But you have individuals, and then those individuals form what is known as a population, or it's a group of individuals within the same species that live in the same area. So obviously you can have populations that are on different continents who are the same species, but specifically most of the time we're talking about populations that will interact with each other. Obviously this will get a little bit more complicated if we're talking about migratory animals. Bird populations can be a little bit more muddled up because they can travel from place to place. But generally, if we're going to take, let's say, some terrestrial organism, such as these elk, populations are individuals that are interacting in the same area who have the ability to affect one another. You then have a community. So the community is scaling up and now talking about different species within an environment. So community is, how do these different, say, elk, moose, interact with the natural predators as the natural predators, as well as plant life in their environment? What do these organisms eat? What eats them? What affects these relationships? You can then scale that up further to include the ecosystem. And so the difference between the community and the ecosystem is that ecosystems are organisms in an area plus all the physical factors that are around them that are not living. So I don't have that in this presentation, but there are two terms we'll talk about later in the semester, which are abiotic and biotic factors. And so ecosystems are including both of those. And so biotic factors would be factors that are living, so other organisms, and abiotic factors would be everything else in an environment that isn't living. So the rocks, the water, the weather, the pollution, anything that is not a living factor that might actually affect an organism is part of that ecosystem. And so this is a really broad subject, but something that's really important to scientists, as most ecosystems are interacting with one another. And so that gets us to the biome, right? So a biome is a mosaic of connected ecosystems and how they might connect. Or in how they might interact. So for instance, in this picture, we're looking at pretty much all of Canada. We're looking at all of this frozen land. Up here, this tundra that we'll talk about later, and how those interact. So how does the forest land interact with the tundra, and interact with man-made spaces, interact with the rivers, right? And so all of scientists have very different concerns when it comes to these varying levels. So when we talk about these different branches of ecology, it's a good point. Professor. When we talk about these varying branches, we'll just talk about like what kind of questions scientists might ask and how they pertain to that particular level. So we're going to start small and we're going to get broad. And so, you know, the first level is organismal ecology. So looking at individuals and within a specific population. And so it can be a lot of different things. And so this is another thing that we'll talk about as we get more specific with ecology. But ecology comes in many forms. It's not just going out in the field. It's not just looking at things in natural environment. You can study the physiology of an organism. So the chemicals that are going in, the processes that they're doing, metabolism, things like that. You can study specifically their behavior. So how organisms have decided to, you know, spiders changing their webs or how they respond to temperature changes, right? You can have how their structure, psychology, or behavior meet the challenges by their environment. How do these organisms survive? And how do we ask questions to learn about that? And so classic questions would be, you know, how do jumping spiders select mates? And how do spiders, you know, say jumping spiders, once again, a specific species, how do they survive winter? One thing you will note is that a lot of these branches of ecology get very muddled up, especially when you're dealing with scientific questions that come at an intermediate level. So for instance, how jumping spiders select mates could be an organismal level, depending on what you're looking at, if you're looking at individuals' behavior. But it could also be an population ecology question, right? Asking how do they just select mates is now an interaction between multiple people. And so when you're talking about levels of ecology, knowing what question you want to answer and how you're going to answer it will really determine the total field. But again, scientists aren't, you know, very few people doing ecology are like, I'm just an organismal ecologist or populate. Like there's some middle ground between a lot of these. And so when you scale it up, you get to populations, right? Which is the studies of interactions between a living species and an environment. So again, we have this jumping spider. This is actually one that does a mating dance. So you can see it's waving its arms in the air. It's raising the roof, and you know it's presenting this like pretty little display it has on its back. And so within population ecology, you have factors, you know, looking at population size and how it affects them over time. So, you know, mate selection, mate competition, what niches these organisms have, you know, and, you know, even something as how does environmental factors affect the reproduction rates of spiders that make webs, right? Things like that. And so really quick, I'm going to show you a nice fast video on mate selection. So what kind of things organisms get into. Let's see. Where is my PowerPoint? No, that's not it. There we go.
To unlock the world's
I'm old enough, by the way, to remember, I don't know if any of you are, when YouTube had absolutely no ads on them at any point. And I missed that time. So this video is very quick, but you can see, you know, these are peacock spiders, right? They're doing these cute little dances. They present their hind legs. Then do they do this dance so that female spiders will know that they are not to be eaten, and they try to woo. So this male here is trying to woo this female right here. And so ecologists might ask a lot of different questions. You know, similar to birds, they're trying to show how, you know, presentable both in their coloration and in their body plans. They do a special dance so that females know that they're the right species and that they're worthy of being mated. mated with. And so scientists could ask questions such as what decides whether one of these males fails at mating or another. Because one thing that usually happens in spiders, at least in jumping spiders and a lot of orb weaving spiders, it's if if a female decides that she doesn't want to mate with you, she might often eat you. And so, you know, population ecologists can ask what decides whether or not a female will eat the male, um, and how the different dances vary between species and things like that. And so there's just a lot of different levels, scientists can look at when it comes to things like that. You then get up into community ecology, so asking questions about how species interact, getting outside of a single population. And so how do predators and prey lead to varying effects on the community, on structure, introducing of, say, base predators. So reintroducing wolves and bobcats into a population of a forest population. How does that affect the lives of hares? How are the rabbit populations responding to this introduction of predators? You then get into ecosystem ecology, once again, talking about energy flow and chemical cycling. So that's something that we'll talk about in later lectures about, how energy flows, these chemical cycles, and how they affect organisms and the environment, how food chains affect one another. So how, the eating of fish by tortoises leads to changes in coral reefs, right? Quick question. Is it common theme in biology for species to consume other organisms of the same species? So that is a very, very broad question, and it really depends on what organism you're looking at. So certain organisms are much more cannibalistic than others. Obviously, anything that isn't an omnivore and a carnivore probably wouldn't do that. In general, herbivores aren't eating each other. But in spiders specifically, it can be pretty common. In a lot of insects, such as praying mantises, it could be common. Um, but it's not something that's happens all the time. It also depends on that. So that's actually a really good question for population ecology, but also ecosystem ecology, right? So you have what causes spiders, within the same population to cannibalize each other. They're very territorial. So if an organism's more territorial, more likely to eat something that comes around. But it also could be an ecosystem question, right? What happens to in an environment to force spiders to prey upon each other? What happens to their prey source, right? If you don't have enough flies, you have a drought, and so there aren't a lot of fly populations popping up. Maybe spiders will eat each other more. And so, yeah, that's something that gets into a lot of these questions scientists might ask. You then have biome ecology. So again, focusing on the factors that control energy and materials and organisms against multiple ecosystems. And so this biome ecology can vary greatly on scale also, depending on your question. So, biomes, in this case, if you look at this map, we're looking at a number of things, right? So we have like these isolated island forests up here. We have rivers here. We have then these different patchworks of grasslands on these sides. And so an ecologist might ask, how does the plant matter that's changing here on these fields affect the nutrition or the plants in this river? How does the river pollution affect these these grasslands on the sides? And so again, this can scale up to a lot of different things. It's very broad. But really, you're talking about multiple ecosystems: river, forest, grassland, things like that. And then biosphere is just our entire world, right? how do regional exchange of energy and materials influence function and distribution of organisms? And so this could be looking at, plant life. It could be looking at these smaller areas and how they affect one another. How does pollution in China, or how does pollution in the Mediterranean Sea leak out into the Atlantic Ocean or something like that, right? How does something happening locally affect organisms in a much broader sense? So, for instance, I'll be talking about biomagnification later. And one of the things we'll talk about is how, DDT, which is a chemical that builds up in bodies and environments, we no longer use that chemical, but it was something that was used in China for 30 or 40 years after we stopped. And so it's still something that leaks into the environment because it was used for so long sitting there. And so, there are different levels again to this. So the biosphere is the sum of all the planet's ecosystems and biomes. And what we'll specifically talk about is, water cycle, nitrogen and carbon, and a little bit of the phosphorus cycle, how these different nutrients travel within environments and how they relate to one another as on the world overall. And so for our world, I'm going to go over quickly some different things that affect biomes distribution. Um, and so one thing is, seasonality. We don't really think about it, or we think about it depending on where we are. Yeah. Oh, yes, Professor Aiken, Silent Spring is a great thing, and I will plug that later also in my PowerPoints when we're talking about DDT, because Rachel Carson was a badass, and she did a lot of really awesome stuff for nature in general, but she actually helped create the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So we'll talk more about that, but she's a really great person to learn about. And so seasonality affects, organisms in a really great way. Obviously, organisms able to live in the winter or preparing for winter compared to spring are very different. And so seasonality is caused by, the tilt of the axis of the earth, right? Um, as the earth rotates, oh, as the earth rotates, I guess I should have made that picture pop up earlier. As the earth rotates and its passive movement, so you have changing of the days as well as its movement around the sun. Well, obviously, we know this changes seasons, changes day length, solar radiation, not ration, solar radiation and temperature, and that these factors are based on their location on the earth. And so, for instance, looking at this globe on the right, one thing we'll talk about is a lot about latitude and how this affects distribution of species and different populations and biomes. But no matter what, depending on seasonality, the equator is always pointed, closest to the sun and is always the warmest part. And then depending on the season, and the axis, the tilting of the axis, the northern or southern hemisphere might be closer to that. And so, you have highest temperatures in the middle. And also, one thing we'll talk about is you often have the highest biodiversity where there are high temperatures, which makes sense, right? If you think about it, where if most of the energy in an environment is being created by plants, the more sunlight you have, the more plants will be able to grow, and the more likely you're going to have other organisms that are able to live off those plants. And so the poles have lower temperatures, and the middle has higher temperatures. But obviously, this varies a lot because we have other, we're not just looking at a 2D system, right? The Earth is three-dimensional, and so we have geography and elevation from mountains and things like that. But one thing to note, obviously, seasons are opposite across the equator. If you are in the southern hemisphere right now, you're going to be going into winter, whereas now we're going into summer. It's pretty convenient for me because all the spiders I study happen to be in like a southern, in the southern half of the earth. And so when it's too cold to get spiders here, I actually have collaborators who are able to send me spiders because it's spring, or summer actually just ended in South Africa, right? So there's going to be this time change in what's occurring. And so Not only obviously does seasonality and your latitude and longitude lines on the earth matter for looking at ecology and what distribution of species there are, but there's also this idea of global air circulation. And so, distribution of systems is not based just on latitude, obviously. But there are many dynamic factors that affect distribution. So, for instance, air movement, right? You have circulation of air that is coming from many, many different places. For instance, the temperatures from our relative area of the Earth are caused by movements coming from different areas, so we have bodies of water which are constantly being heated and cooled by the sun, which are causing temperatures to vary, right? We know that water is really good at absorbing heat, right? So those bodies of water are going to heat up during the day, but then during the night they're going to start to cool off and release humidity. And so those air patterns are actually going to affect other places in the world, right? The air doesn't just stop. So, for instance, we're on the East Coast here. Our air is coming down. It's flowing down from Canada, from Greenland. It's going into the Atlantic Ocean. It's being spiraled through the air. And so, it's cold. It's picking up some warm air. It's swirling around Africa, coming back up through the Atlantic, through this area. And so, after it picks up this heat from this middle section and then gets pulled over to Europe, right? And so we have these temperature changes and these weather changes based on these air currents that are occurring. And so air flows over these bodies of water and picks up humidity. And so not only are air currents bringing temperature with them and changing the local environment, but they're also bringing humidity, right? So they're going to decide whether or not it's humid there. It's going to decide whether or not it's going to rain there or it's going to snow there. All of these circulation issues have great effects, not only locally, but super far away in other regions because everything is connected, right? And so, England is warmer due to than Canada, even though England is technically higher up latitude wise, because this warm air that comes in from the Caribbean gets pushed off to England after it's been warmed from Canada. And so, again, just because you're in a higher latitude doesn't necessarily mean um, that it's going to make it warmer, because it's very Canada. It's very complicated. Oh, Canada. And so not only does the circulation, come from bodies of water and go over, but global air circulation is also, again, affected by things such as elevation. So talking about mountain ranges, right? Let's say you have air flowing over the ocean. You have this humid air that's coming in, and it's going to hit the land. So you have this air flowing, but then it hits a mountain range. And so that air is going to have to do work to go up the mountain and then back down. Obviously, you have air currents that are flowing up here that'll go straight through it. But one thing that you'll notice is that often, these rain clouds will get stuck. You'll have isolated weather effects on different sides of the mountain, right? This mountain will block airflow, and so you'll have air that's going to is going to cool down as it goes up the mountain, and then it'll start heating up as it comes back down. But this environment up here is going to be much different than on each side. And if you look at this example here, this area is getting a lot more water, right? You have airflow coming in, you have clouds coming in, the water is probably going to rain, precipitation is going to come in, and then that water is going to flow back down into this area and not go into the other valley inside of this mountain. And so there are probably examples all over the world where this happens in reverse or doesn't happen at all. But what I'd like you to know is that mountains complicate this air circulation by creating natural barriers that will affect both precipitation as well as airflow. And when we get into things like water cycle and nitrogen cycle and stuff like that, what we'll notice is that, obviously where this water is able to distribute is going to greatly affect what organisms are there. But yeah, many possible outcomes, just one thing. And so, warm, moist air hits a mountain, the air rises and cools and then releases that moisture into precipitation. And then you have this cold, wet air on the other side. And so, also, when you think about it, mountains will naturally limit the amount of sunlight that's reaching an area, right? The sun, as during different times of the year will and times of the day, will be coming from different angles. And so, this, the amount during the time of the year when the sun is on this side, depending on the orientation of this mountain, this side of the mountain may get much, much less sun. And thus, in this case, it looks a little bit, there's no plants, right? This might be an area where the sun is coming through, hitting the mountain, and then there's very little sunlight that makes it over here. And perhaps the cold, wet air further limits what's allowed to live there. Um, and so when we look at ecosystems, terrestrial biomes are what we're talking about now. Next class, we'll talk about aquatic biomes and things like that, because obviously underwater, they're a little bit more complicated. But the distribution of these biomes, again, is controlled by climate and disturbance. And we'll talk about disturbance more in the future. But disturbance is any type of thing that can upset the natural balance. And so that can be something like us, for instance, man-made disturbance, us breaking down environments, logging, building houses. But it could also be natural disturbances such as volcanoes, earthquakes, some type of disaster that's going to change the environment. But a big thing about this is, again, all of these changes, all of these interactions are going to change what organisms can live there. For instance, they'll change primarily what plant life is there. And again, we're starting at the bottom and moving up, right? If you do not have any plants in an environment growing, you don't have enough sunlight or nutrients, those plants aren't going to be able to sustain herbivores who are not going to be able to sustain carnivores. And so what plants are allowed to grow will determine the higher up ecology. And so there are ideas of microclimate, so very fine localized climate conditions. And then there's macroclimate, which would be a larger distribution. But biome is, if you have plenty of water in an environment, for instance, but you don't have any nitrogen, plants aren't going to be able to grow, right? They won't be able to make those amino acids. And thus, even if you have pristine, say, conditions without the proper nutrients for the plants and or animals to eat, they're not going to be able to have a successful population grow. And so biome type is based on availability of resources, amount of rain, and temperature. And so I'm not going to ask you to memorize specifically what any of these biomes are, but I would like you to know how their distribution is complicated and cluttered. So for instance, this graph here is looking at precipitation and temperature. So on the x-axis, we have how much water in centimeters a place is getting, and then the annual temperature over the year on the left. And what we'll see is, certain environments make sense, right? If you have very little precipitation, very little water, and very high temperatures, that's a desert, right? You're going to have organisms that are trying to live in order to maximize how much water they can keep in because they're getting so little. And then you're going to have plants, for instance, that have a higher amount of wax. You're also going to have those cam plants, right, that are going to be opening at night in order to deal with these different things. And so we're not talking too much about evolution. You'll talk about that more in 108. But also I'd like you to think about how these biomes, how these different, temperatures will affect organisms and their adaptations, right? How they have to respond to their environments. And so, you have temperature here. So if you have, low, a decent amount of rain and low temperatures, you have tundras and Arctic regions. In this case here, this 0 line is actually freezing because this is in Celsius. And so if you have primarily frozen land, you're going to limit what organisms can grow, right? And so that would be a tundra. But then once you get up to having more rain and more average temperature, you start growing different types of forest, right? You have temperate grasslands and forest lands. If you have a lot of water and temperature, you have tropical forests. And a quick note, tropical forests are where you'll find the largest biodiversity. And can anyone guess why tropical forests would have the largest amount of biodiversity? Any ideas? Yep. So yep, we have two answers and they're both correct. Or three. Yeah. So you have more plant biodiversity, right? And why is that? Because you have more water that's coming in, and then you have more energy coming in through sunlight. This creates a lot of available resources. So, if you simply think about when it's rained a lot, how many mosquitoes come out, right? When it's been a rainy season, you have a lot more mosquitoes and a lot more gnats. Why? Because every patch of excess water has extra nutrients in it, has extra energy from plants. You have photosynthetic bacteria and things like that. And so available resources allows a lot more organisms to form different types of niches in their environment. Oh, man. And so this dictates what plants can survive and which organisms. If we look at how these ecosystems are distributed around the world, you'll see that they do generally fall into specific latitude and longitude lines. For instance, temperate grasslands are all in this higher, above 30 degrees are all found here, or 30 degrees down here. There's like a specific distance as they are from the equator. Obviously, this is varying depending on elevation. For instance, if you look at North America here, this green part here is a temperate broadleaf forest. What's happening over here compared to middle America? Over here on the right side, we have a lot more mountains, right? We have a lot of mountain ranges that are going through here. We have the Appalachian Trail, and that's actually separating out this, temperate grassland from these big forests. Also, if you look at the left side of America, again, you have these high mountain ranges that are going through California, Seattle, all of that area. And so those areas are going to be ecosystem specifically much different than, again, middle America, which has mountains on both sides. And so you have this much lower amount of organisms being grown. Then you have down here, looking at Latin America, looking at the equator, Colombia, Africa, and you'll see that we have all of these tropical forests, right? Almost all the biodiversity is in this region. And again, a lot of these areas here are relatively flat in terms of, Oceania and Africa. You then have, a distribution of deserts, and, desert is a lot different. It has a lot more to do with, again, what plants are able to be there. And so at the end of this presentation, I have two videos just looking at what is a tundra and what is a desert, because I feel like they're very different. One's super hot, one's super cold. But again, this is all affected by what kind of plants can live in an environment. Let's see. Let's see. Why is there not a coniferous forest south of the tropics of Capricorn? Um, let's see. I'm assuming that it has to do with the adaptations of the trees in that area. So why are there not these coniferous forests below this area? I'm assuming that those forests primarily have to do with cold temperature, just like you have only there's not much you have tundra here, and as Professor Aiken just said, right, as you get closer to the polar ice caps in the south, there's not nearly as much land, right? Most of the southern hemisphere's continents are a little bit higher. So perhaps if we had more land that was closer to this region by the polar ice, we would have more chances to have these conifer trees up here and the tundra, right? Both of these ecosystems do not exist down here because you're missing this large group of areas. And so, when we talk about biomes and we talk about each of these, not only are we talking about, where they are in the earth, but, they're characterized by their vegetation type, their physical environment, and what organisms can live there. Um, and live there. And so climate determines plants. So those are scaling up, right? So climate determines plants. Plants determine the biome and what organisms can live there. And because what we'll go through with these cycles a little bit in the future is the fact that plants and fungi um, and microorganisms help determine how much water stays in the soil, how much rain hits the ground, right? If you have a canopy of trees, those trees might block a lot of the water from hitting the ground. So that'll affect what vegetation happens lower on. How much sunlight hits the ground. Once again, if you have all those trees growing that are blocking out the sun, you'll have a lot of foliage in a dense forest on the ground. And then and then again, how plants block wind and things like that. So for instance, one cool thing is they're actually slowly getting rid of this desert region in northern Africa. How they're doing that is they are slowly planting billions and millions of trees over the years in this region where they can sustain themselves. And so they're adding more plants. Those plants are slowly stopping erosion, keeping water in the soil, and are slowly allowing organisms and other plants, other animals to live closer and closer to this higher region. And so they're actually slowly getting rid of desert land by planting more trees. So biomes can actually be greatly changed by our effect on it. But as we said, most diversity is in those forests. And so, um, as I said, general features of these biomes, they're characterized by their climate features. So a name such as a temperate forest would be a forest that has a changing and dynamic environment around it, or by their microorganisms and larger organisms. Animals evolve to their environment and they can find similar places to live in very different places if they're a similar environment. So for instance, as we were saying before, form and function, organisms will have traits set for their environment. And even if that environment is in very different places around the earth, those organisms can evolve similar adaptations, which can lead to a similar environment. So, for instance, similar species tend to live in biomes, even if they are very diverse. So, on the left here, we have a cactus plant, right? We have this can plant that is living in a desert. It has this waxy layer. It's holding onto water very, very well. It's trying to survive in this desert environment. You then have in different parts of the world, for instance, in different deserts, you have these euphorbia plants, which look just like cactuses, right? They have a very similar setup, very similar shape to their body. And they are a completely different genus. They look similar. They have similar physical adaptations for a desert environment, but they're a completely different lineage of plant that grew up in a similar biome type. And so this is similar to insect wings. This is similar to the body shape of aquatic animals. You will have very distant organisms evolve very similar adaptations because they need to survive in that biome, right? They need to survive in that sunlight, that level of water, and things like that. That's also why when you talk about evolution, a lot of things are conserved, right? Certain, organisms always have to keep water in themselves. So most plants have that cell wall. Most living plant, most animals have that epidermal epithelial cells in order to keep in water as well, right? We're all struggling with similar issues, just in a different environment. And I didn't mean for that to be a metaphor for life, but it is. And so those general features of biomes will affect how organisms can evolve. And so I just have two videos. We have 3 minutes left, so just showing examples of these biomes. Originally, this video is like cool biomes.exe. But so we have tundra. So, tundras are located in that most northern region, right before we get to that Arctic region where nothing can grow. And so tundras are biomes where there are living organisms, but tree growth is hindered by low temperatures and short growing seasons. So, for instance, Alaska, Alaska has sunlight for, what is it? I think 2 months of the year. It has constant sunlight for 2 months of the year, while during their warm months, because the sun never truly sets because of that angle, right? We have that seasonality. And so plants will grow very, very consistently for that time. But then for 9 months, that area is pretty much cold and pretty much sunless and very dark. And so the organisms that live there are going to need to be able to acclimate to that changing environment. No. Sorry. So let's look at what tundras are.
What are tundras? Tundras are among the Earth's coldest and harshest biomes. These ecosystems are treeless regions with extreme cold and low rainfall.
So if you think about it, if they have low rainfall and they don't have a very long growing season, how are trees going to grow, right? Trees are going to be larger organisms that need a lot more sunlight, need consistent materials in order to do that secondary growth, in order to grow tall. And so if you only have a very short season of light, what's going to be able to live? Only smaller grasses and smaller plants, especially with those limited.
There are two different types of tundras, alpine and Arctic. Alpine tundras occur on mountains where trees cannot grow in the high altitudes.
You have limiting oxygen.
There, the growing season is about 180 days.
Oh, 3 months.
Mountain goats, sheep, marmots, and birds feed on low-lying plants and insects. Arctic tundra extends from the edge of the Arctic Ocean down to the coniferous forest of the taiga. Permafrost prevents trees from taking root. But shrubs and other vegetation grow during the short summers, which range from 50 to 60 days.
Okay, yeah.
A variety of wildlife, including Arctic foxes, polar bears, and caribou, live in the Arctic tundra. Global warming is changing the Arctic tundra, and the changing tundra is contributing to global warming. The Arctic's permafrost is deteriorating, which alters not only the landscape, but also the plants and animals that can live there. In addition, permafrost contains about 14% of the Earth's carbon. So as it melts, that carbon is released into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming.
Cool. All right, so we have these tundras, right? We have this seasonality that is limiting what can take root and how long plants have to grow in these environments. So tundras are completely blanketing and stopping trees. One thing that they mentioned was a taiga, which is essentially a tundra, but they have longer growing seasons. So you actually have trees that are able to take hold. The taigas would be something that would be, akin to like northern Russia, in which you have more of these like frozen forests, essentially. But as a example of something that is, another limiting environment, I just have deserts, right? You have these extreme heat with, again, with low amounts of water. But in this biome, I'd like to point out that the limiting factor is not as much sunlight, right? You're not going to have this energy that is limiting. There's plenty of sun in the desert, and so you always are going to have that nutrients available. But what's limiting life in this biome instead? Water, right? You have water that's not being there. You have dirt, which we'll talk about in terms of like its soil and its concentration about how it helps retain water. If you have a lot of sand and that uncompacted ground, it's not going to hold water very well, right? And so little precipitation and the lack of vegetation exposes the surface to denutrition. So think about erosion, right? You have wind that's blowing, and without trees and plant matter to keep that ground solid, wind is actually going to blow stuff away and make it even harder for things to take hold. And so this is the last thing I have for you, is this video on deserts. I'll post everything online. If you have to go, you can go, but I just wanted to show another nice example of a cool biome.
Wind whips over a barren wasteland. Vast nothingness as far as the eye can see, or so it may seem. Creatures peek out of burrows, scurry across the sand, and soar through the sky, revealing a landscape not as lifeless as it may first appear. Deserts are often defined as areas of land that receive less than 10 inches of rainfall each year. These regions are low in humidity and can even be moisture deficient, evaporating water faster than it is received. While most deserts are found in the mid-latitudes, these diverse ecosystems occur on all 7 continents and make up nearly 1/3 of Earth's total landmass. Deserts are sometimes classified into 4 major types: subtropical, semi-arid, coastal, and polar.
So if you think about it, as they were describing the tundras as well as these deserts, there are even, these are very broad definitions for biomes, right? I don't know if you've ever thought about, but there are 4 different types of deserts, right? And so there are 4 very different ways of having a minimal amount of water and how organisms will evolve to those environments. And also these environments, right? Deserts are not isolated. They're going to be surrounded by other biomes. So you're going to have differences in desert type and what organisms can live there. If your desert is, say, near a tropical forest, or your desert leads into the ocean, you're going to have different types of organisms adapting and interacting with one another.
Subtropical deserts are found along the equator in the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. They are the hottest deserts on Earth, with daytime temperatures that can reach up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Semi-arid deserts are located in Asia, Europe, and North America. These cold winter deserts often form when tall mountain ranges block moisture through a process called the rain shadow effect. Coastal deserts form alongside the tropical western edges of certain continents. Despite their proximity to water, coastal deserts remain dry. Polar deserts are found in the Arctic and Antarctic. The other end of the extreme, winter temperatures in the Antarctic desert average around -50 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right, frozen deserts.
While deserts experience extreme temperatures and receive very little precipitation, they are still important habitats for plants and animals. Desert animals, such as the coyote, have evolved to withstand harsh desert conditions by burrowing into the cool ground and emerging at night when desert temperatures drop. Many desert plants, including the saguaro cactus, have established long and shallow root systems to better absorb what minimal moisture might be present in the ground. Highly specialized to survive in such a harsh environment, desert wildlife is particularly vulnerable to ecological changes. Existing deserts have become less habitable because of rising temperatures that dry up scarce water resources and increase the risk of wildfires. Additionally, new desert areas are beginning to form through desertification. This phenomenon occurs when factors such as deforestation, climate change, and resource mismanagement degrade the biological productivity of a region, thereby creating a desert. For instance, in Central Asia, poor irrigation practices and excessive water usage dried up the Aral Sea and formed the youngest desert on the planet. But by practicing responsible agriculture, better management of limited water resources, and limiting further development, it may be possible to curb desertification while protecting our surprisingly rich desert ecosystems.
Right. And so we're trying to combat that by doing, the exact opposite, right? Talking about planting trees, trying to get moisture and vegetation and things into the soil to keep these from extending. But obviously, there are a lot of factors that are minimally outside of the average person's control in their ability to kind of limit climate change and how this is occurring. So that's it. These are the concept questions I'd like you to know for this unit about, relationships between organisms and how essentially think about how plants help decide what types of organisms can live in an environment and how these different levels of ecology come together to have us understand overall what's happening. So obviously I'll post this all online, but thank you all for coming. Does anyone have any questions about anything on this presentation or anything?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? Anyone else? Anyone hanging out?
Hey, Professor, I have a quick question just on just the upcoming quiz.
Yeah.
Is this, I was kind of like looking over the study guide, and it seemed to me like I guess my question is kind of going to be based on on what you answer, but is there going to be a more of an emphasis on kind of like when we start looking at animal function and form and digestion and all that over like the first couple chapters, which were more on like the plant life and plant structure, or is it going to be kind of spread out pretty evenly?
It's going to be spread out. Try to be pretty even, but if anything, I think it's more on a little bit more on the plant stuff. But yeah, it's going to be an even distribution. I tried to cut down the concept questions. I tried to cut down the concept questions to just the ones that would be most important. But yeah, so those each of those will be on it in some capacity.
Perfect. And what kind of like just using concept questions to study. I know what I usually do is I kind of look over the book and I annotate in the book and then kind of condense notes onto paper. But obviously there's a lot of definitions and a lot of different topics that became pretty relevant in this unit. So how would you kind of recommend using the concept questions that you provide us to study, or in like what way should we use those concept questions?
So I was thinking, I think the easiest thing to do would be to use the PowerPoints in conjunction with the concept questions, as opposed to the textbook. I try really hard to question you on things that I've specifically said, as opposed to something that might be more ingrained. But I think ultimately I try to ask questions that kind of try to pull concepts together in terms of, the comparison between plants and animals, for instance, and how we have, again, like how we have similar but very different ways of accomplishing the same things and with dealing with like the same, dealing with the same type of issues.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it, Professor.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions?
I think Ethan had something that we wanted to chat about after class. If there are no other questions apart from that, then I'll maybe we can say goodbye to everybody and have our chat.
Yeah, I'm gonna make you the host. Make sure it doesn't do anything.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye, Annie. Ethan, if it